and so we should probably consider what herpetology is. And so that obviously is the scientific study of amphibians and reptiles. And it's different than a lot of the other classes, because most other classes, well, some of them are similar to this, but the vertebrate classes particularly are a little bit different. Because this herpetology includes amphibians and reptiles, which are different from each other, very different from each other. So it's a little bit different. And so I want to think a little bit about, why we lump reptiles, which are fairly different from amphibians, into one course instead of, have a snake class or a reptile class and an amphibian class like you might with birds and mammals, because they are in different classes, just like birds are different than mammals, and so we study those differently. So there's some reasons behind that. It mostly, or a lot of it, is historical. Well, maybe not so much, but historically they have been lumped together. As early naturalists and early scientists started describing the biology of these animals, they tended to include them into the same group. And much of that came from their ecology. There's some things about them that are very similar that kind of dictates what they do, right? And so typically they're found in the same habitats. Not always, right? A Nile crocodile is going to be found in a very specific habitat. Most other amphibians and reptiles are going to be found in more general types of habitats. So if I ask you to go out into the landscape in West Tennessee and pick a single habitat where you would find the most amphibians and reptiles, what would it be?
Swamp.
What's that?
Swamp.
A swamp. Maybe a swamp, but probably not a swamp. How come? What might exclude lots of amphibians and reptiles from a swamp?
The water.
The water, right? So a lot of amphibians and reptiles are not aquatic. And so the swamp is going to eliminate a good bit of amphibians and reptiles. So that's a commonly, well, it's a great habitat for some amphibians and reptiles. You'll find lots of amphibians and reptiles in a swamp, but you'll find more in a different habitat.
Creeks?
A creek is a small stream. Is that what you're talking about? So just by virtue of that, you're going to eliminate a bunch of them. What is it about a small stream that would kind of preclude you from finding the most amount of amphibians and reptiles?
Water.
Well, there's water there, but a creek is a small stream. What else would limit it? It's not very big, it's small, right? So just by random chance alone, if I threw all the amphibians and reptiles out there, only a small proportion of them are gonna land in a small habitat. So, and that's, I'm exaggerating a little bit and being kind of silly, but that's part of it, right? So it's a relatively limited type of habitat. The only animals that can live there are ones that can maybe feed on stream animals, but that's gonna be also pretty limited just because of the volume and the complexity of that. What else? The woods, otherwise known as forest, right? So most amphibians and reptiles are going to be found in a forest. And part of that is because in forest, you've got what? It's not just all the same kind of tree and all the same kind of habitat. In a forest, you've got habitat heterogeneity, right? You've got wetlands that fill up periodically, which are awesome for amphibians. And you've got some open habitat with lots of sunshine. So all that's going to be included in a forest. So you go out to a forest, you're going to find a bunch of these animals, amphibians and reptiles. And so that's part of the reason why we kind of lump them together, because they're found in the same habitats. And they often do similar things in the ecosystem, right? So if we think about their trophic status, like where they fit in whether they're predators or prey, then they tend to be found in roughly the same spot, right? Not geographically, but in their roles. And so if I said, okay, tell me, I'm going to give you one type of food item that's going to be eaten by most amphibians and reptiles, what would it be?
Insects?
Not necessarily like insects, but you're on the right track. another term for animals that are
Invertebrates?
invertebrates, right? So small organisms that are living where? In the forest. Yeah, because there's lots of, decomposition, there's lots of food available for the invertebrates, so there's lots of those critters crawling around, and most of them are gonna eat that, right? Salamanders are gonna eat it, frogs are gonna eat it, snakes are gonna eat it when they're small, and then of course that's a little too narrow, like some bigger snakes are not gonna eat ants, they're gonna eat a squirrel, right? But when they're little, they might eat frogs and things like that. So what they're doing in the ecosystem is generally similar to each other. They affect the soil, and they do a lot of other things that relate to interactions among different types of animals. They might have the same type of microbiota on the skin of their surface, on the surface of their skin. So they're doing a lot of different things that are very similar. So for those reasons, we kind of lump them together in the field of herpetology. But they are very different from each other. And so I want to talk a little bit about just the kind of the general features of these guys. And so as far as taxonomy goes, there's not a lot of complicated taxonomy that I'm going to give to you, but I just want you to understand kind of where they fit in the grand scheme of things. And I'm going to talk about the evolutionary history of amphibians and reptiles, so you'll know where these things came from and how they're related to each other. But when we're talking about amphibians, this is going to apply to reptiles as well, and fishes for that matter. But these are all animals in the phylum Chordata, so kingdom Animalia, they're animals. They're in the phylum Chordata, which means they have what? Can somebody tell me what that means? They have a notochord, which is what? Oh,
Your back.
What's that?
Isn't it in your back, or the bottom of your spine, and it fuses, and you don't?
Well, sort of.
Is it a prehensile tail?
It's only on your back if you're doing what I'm doing. I'm standing up, but if you're not standing up, which is most vertebrates, where is it? On the top, right? Otherwise known as dorsal, right? So you've got this notochord, which is a cartilage-based semi-stiff rod that supports muscle attachment and things like that. So in many cases, that's going to be replaced by the vertebral column, which is bone, but that takes the place as you develop. That's going to take the place of the notochord. So these animals have a notochord. What else do they have? What? A postanal tail, right? So that just means the muscles and the blood vessels and all that extends beyond the end of that digestive system. That's the main point, right? There are some animals, like an earthworm. On the front end, you got the mouth. On the very back end, you got the anal opening, and that's where undigested stuff comes out. In chordates, there's musculature and sometimes stuff associated with locomotion beyond the end of the digestive system. So postanal tail, I don't know if I'll go back. Oh, what's that? Okay. What else? Notochord, postanal tail, what else?
Dorsal and hollow nerve.
A dorsal and hollow nerve cord. Otherwise known as what? The spinal cord, right? So I hesitate to use that term because a lot of times we refer to our spine and really we're talking about our backbone, right? And so those are completely different things. The backbone is what's left over from the reorganization of the notochord. That's bony support, and that's going to be important for amphibians and reptiles because that's going to help us attach musculature. That's going to allow arms and legs to do this stuff. So the vertebral column is coming from the notochord. The dorsal hollow nerve cord is the central nervous system, right? So that links the brain to the rest of the organism, and that runs along the notochord. And then, of course, in some organisms, you've got these, the vertebral column kind of has arches and sometimes spines that protect the spinal cord or the dorsal hollow nerve cord, because if that's interrupted, then the animal's not going to function very well. So you got, what do we say? Notochord, postanal tail, dorsal hollow nerve cord, what else? Bella, I feel like you're probably most freshly out of freshman biology, is that?
Yeah, I took 130 and 140 last semester, so.
Yeah. Anybody else took ichthyology? I'm gonna hurt my feelings, those of you.
Cranium.
Well, not necessarily, as far as chordata goes. the craniates, the craniata, they do have a cranium to protect the brain, but as far as chordate, not all of them have a cranium. So that's not really a feature of the chordates. What else?
Is it the,
Huh?
is it the cerebellum or like the cerebral hemispheres?
No, not necessarily for all chordates. Come on, y'all fresh out of ichthyology, come on.
Respiration?
Well, yeah, something about respiration.
With lungs or through the skin?
Huh?
With lungs or through the skin?
No, fish are chordate, so they don't breathe with lungs. Some do. Some of them do. There you go.
Gills.
Put me in my place, Cameron. Huh?
With gills, lungs? the skin?
Yeah, so gills only work if there's something else. What is it?
Diaphragm?
Nope.
Gas bladder.
No.
Air.
No.
Water.
No, yeah.
Blood.
How do you get water across the gills?
The breathing, some sort of
Well,
respiration?
I'm really looking at the ichthyology graduates here. I mean, I might have to go back and change some grades.
We've slept since then.
All right, so you've got gills, and then water has to go across the gills.
They come in contact.
That has to come in contact, but how does it get there?
Movement?
Movement of what?
This water.
Well, yeah, how does the water move? Where's it coming from?
Gravity.
Brachial.
It's on to something.
Brachial, no, it's brachial skeleton. It's,
There's a brachial skeleton. So, all right, so if you're a fish, and so I'm a fish, I have to get water across onto the gills. Through what orifice is the water gonna come in? The mouth. So it comes in the mouth, and then if I don't have these things, it can't get out. No, not gills, but you're on the right. It has to get out so it can go across the gills.
Pharyngeal.
Hey, yeah, pharyngeal openings. Openings in the pharynx, right? So water goes in the mouth, there's openings there, comes out those openings, and then across the gill tissues and absorbs oxygen. So all chordates have those. In amphibians, most amphibians and reptiles, they close up, right? During development. Because if you're a terrestrial animal and you have pharyngeal openings, what happens? Huh? Well, if you're a terrestrial animal, you don't have that problem, right? Now I'm out on the land. I'm not using water to get oxygen. I'm using what? Well, what medium is the oxygen coming? Air. So I have to get air from where? The atmosphere to my lungs. How do I accomplish that?
Respiration.
Well,
Breathe.
that happens once the air gets in. Yeah, you breathe. So, and I'm always wondering why I don't get as far as I think I should in herpetology or in my advice, because I like to talk about this stuff, because it's kind of cool. So I got to get air to my lungs. So how do I do that? I open, what orifice? Mouth or? No, neither one. So I open my mouth, and there's no air going in there.
You have to diaphragm.
I have to expand the bronchial or the chest cavity, bring air in. So if I have pharyngeal openings, what's the problem?
There's no vacuum.
Huh?
There's no vacuum for the diaphragm to pull.
Yeah, either air comes in and goes out through the pharyngeal openings and doesn't go to the lungs, or when I move my diaphragm down, air comes in through the pharyngeal openings and doesn't go to the lungs. Either way, air is not going to the lungs, right? So all chordates have pharyngeal openings during development. In fishes and some amphibians, they stay open because they're used for respiration in water across gills. If you're a terrestrial animal, those have to close up so that when the air goes into your buccal cavity and not out through the pharyngeal openings, into the pharynx, into the trachea, into the lungs. And so that's how we respire as terrestrial animals. And most amphibians and reptiles are terrestrial animals, so they're going to be doing the same thing. So they don't have pharyngeal openings. And there's one more thing that chordates have. I'm just going to tell you. It is the precursor to the thyroid gland. And so glandular structures that are going to secrete a variety of hormones. And so I just want to kind of refresh our thoughts about what chordates are. And so those are the things that unite all chordates. All chordates have those things. And then craniates have a cranium that protects the brain, et cetera. And we're talking about animals that are in the superclass Gnathistomata. So this kind of separate, Gnathistomata are those animals that have movable jaws, right? That separates the vertebrates and things like lampreys and hagfish, which are agnatha. They don't have movable jaws, so they're different. Okay, so amphibians are chordates. They're craniates, and that the term that used to be there was, anybody know? That used to be craniata. What's the other term that, it's probably more familiar to you if I said it. It's vertebrata, vertebrates, right? So vertebrates, if I said, well, what's a vertebrate, what would you tell me? Yeah, animal with a backbone, right? And so, but some of them don't have a backbone, right? But all of them have some type of cranium. So that's why we changed that name for vertebrate. Okay, so that's where we are kind of taxonomically. We're in the phylum Chordata, subphylum Craniata, superclass Gnathistomata. So some of the biological characteristics that are more appropriate, I guess, for our discussion, as far as amphibians go. So amphibians have naked skin, which means they don't have some type of covering on top of the skin, or they're not secreting elements that protect the dermis and epidermis. And so, as opposed to animals like fish, of course, and also reptiles that have protein-based scales on top of the epidermis and dermis, so that protects their skin. And so that by itself has a really big influence on what these animals are doing as compared to reptiles, right? So you've got naked skin, which means a lot of things physiologically, ecologically, behaviorally, right? So that by itself makes them have to be very different from reptiles. And that, again, that's one of the kind of reasons why I point out why we're setting them together, even though they're very different from each other in a lot of respects. They also have an amniotic egg, right? So the prefix "an" means what? Without. So these animals do not have an amnion or an amniotic membrane. And so, I'll talk about this later, but what that really means is that there's nothing protecting this embryo. So here's the embryo right here. There's nothing protecting that from drying out. An amniotic membrane surrounds the developing embryo and retains moisture in that space where the embryo is developing. These guys don't have that. And so this embryo is developing in an environment where water could be really easily lost from the embryo. And you gotta think about the embryo is made up mostly of what? Of all living organisms. Mostly what? Water, right? So if you put this embryo in a dehydrating environment, it will dehydrate very quickly because there's nothing stopping the water from evaporating from that. And so, as a consequence, most or all amphibians have to lay their eggs in at least moist, really moist environments. Most of them are going to deposit eggs in standing water. And that's strictly because the embryos don't have any kind of membrane that protects them from drying out. And so the eggs are deposited directly in aquatic environment. This is an American toad. This is the female, this is the male. She's releasing eggs or ova, and he's releasing sperm, fertilize the ova, and now you've got the embryos, and they're sitting in water. And they're protected from drying out because the water's protecting them from that. If that dries up, then the embryos will die. Okay, so amphibians, essentially, they're limited to moist habitats. For this reason, and also this reason. Those are the main reasons why they have to be in moist habitats. They have to reproduce in moist habitats because they have an amniotic egg. Because their skin doesn't have anything covering it, the adults will also dry out pretty quickly. Right? So they can be terrestrial, but they can't live on the surface in dry environments. Right? So when do you see amphibians out? What's that?
In the rain.
In the rain, it doesn't have to be in the rain necessarily, but it has to be humid. So you're gonna see them in the summertime. What time of day, in a 24-hour cycle in the summertime, when are you gonna see amphibians out mucking around? At nighttime, because at nighttime, what's the difference between nighttime and daytime in the summer? It's cooler, it's also what?
The sun's not out.
So more humid, right? So they're active, and it has to be humid, otherwise the water in their tissues just whoop right out into the air, and they'll turn into a salamander jerky in a very short period of time because they have naked skin. So there are aspects of these animals that are extremely different than reptiles just because of those two things, because they have naked skin and they have to reproduce in certain environments. Okay, so the animals that we're talking about, for the most part, in this class as far as amphibians, the ones that still have living representatives are included in 3 separate clades, and that includes the group Caudata, so most often referred to at the level of order. So order Caudata, and that includes the salamanders, the order Anura, which includes the frogs, and the order Gymnophiona, which are the caecilians, which we don't have in this part of the world. They are tropical animals, but they do have several species of living, they're living representatives of that group. So we're not gonna really talk too much about these guys, but know that they exist. Okay, so together, these 3 orders make up a larger group called Lysamphidia. And so this is really, it's probably not just a coincidence, but it is somewhat a coincidence that the only living representatives that we have of amphibians are in this group. There are lots of other amphibians that don't have living representatives anymore, but they're in different groups, and I'll kind of generalize that as we go through the lecture, but mostly what we're talking about is Lysamphidia. So somebody tell me what Lysamphidia means, what it includes.
Salamanders, frogs, and Scythians.
Salamanders, frogs, and Sicilian. All 3 of those are in a larger group called Lysamphibian. I'm gonna go through and talk about why they're in that group together, some of the things that hold them into that group, taxonomically speaking. So I'm gonna stop here because I think it's time to go. And when we come back on Wednesday,